Today we've got two really good people along. We've got Rory Hyde from University of Melbourne. Rory has been at Melbourne University for a while, does a lot of research on housing, provides advice out in industry to places like Shepparton and beyond. Has an interesting history of being into curatorship with the V&A, and also I found out this morning started the Architects on Triple R and was actually the international correspondent for them for quite some time, which is I've also heard has been back over the summer, which is good to see. And we've also got John Stinson, who's giving us a view from overseas. It's very early in the morning, I think 5 o'clock in the UK. And John is with Akana Global. John also worked as a researcher at Napier University in Edinburgh, embedded in the Scottish Energy Centre, and has a keen interest in energy efficient retrofit of housing. So there'll be two really good presentations, and hopefully, as usual, there'll be a bit of an overlap, which will prompt some questions for discussion at the end of the time. So I think we've got notionally 20 minutes from each presenter, hopefully 10 or 15 minutes of good discussion afterwards, and then a quick wrap up of other things that are happening in retrofit at the end. So Rory, I might pass over to you. Do you want to take control?
Thanks, everyone. My name's Rory Hyde. Thanks very much to Brendan, Marita, Sarah, Retrofit Lab for the invitation. I'd also like to echo Brendan's acknowledgement of country. I'm going to speak about retrofitting in the residential sector, so the single family house scale, suburban scale sector. And I've called it Winning the Climate Battle at Home. So the discipline of architecture is fairly hostile to the suburbs. We decry its sameness, its ugliness, its lack of culture, its car dependency, its sprawl, its social isolation. The minds of Australian architecture have said far worse. Robin Boyd, is it just that the Australian public clings to its depressing boxes because it knows no better, has seen no better design? Gabrielle Poole, the suburbs we're putting up are just bloody inhuman. How people live in them, I just don't know. And Glenn Murcutt, our Pritzker Prize winner and the main face of Australian architecture overseas, says, it's appalling housing, it's appalling spatially, it's not architecture, it's merchandise. I like that quote because it's sort of like, it's not architecture, it's not my fault, it's someone else's. This is from the headlines from the newspaper, not much better. Outer suburbs deprived of services, sprawling suburbs destined to become ghettos. This is all from the space of 1 week when I put this talk first together. Traffic, the unwinnable battle in the city's poorly planned outer north. The standard alternatives that our profession puts forward of built environment, urban growth boundaries on the one hand, so prevent it from going further, and then missing middle housing on the other, which says that people who live in these houses should actually live in apartments. In my view, both of those responses suggest that the suburbs shouldn't exist. They kind of deny its continuation. And I would say they don't necessarily address the suburbs on their own terms. So if we are to say that there are good things there, if we are to recognise that people live here, and it's by some estimates 88% of Australia lives in suburban type structures, then we ought to give some benefit of the doubt and also to, I think, take the suburbs on their own terms. So I'm going to look at, well, what would it look like though if we started here and to try to get to here? A kind of systemic upgrading, retrofitting of those suburbs to suggest that rather than dragging us all under, the suburbs could be repurposed to be generous, to be spaces of sharing, to be spaces of sustainability, to be spaces of play, to be spaces of space, and to have all of those great things that the suburbs offer, but done in a sustainable way. So I'm going to give 5 examples very quickly. Some from an article I put together a few years ago called Winning the Battle at Home. All Australian examples, and then a handful of examples from some of my students who've been looking at these questions of how to retrofit suburbia the last few years as well. I've structured the examples from this great graph, which I came across in Jeannie Gang's book, which is called The Art of Architectural Grafting. It's a new book. And what this graph shows, sorry, the text is so small, but I've blown it up as we go, is different strategies and what kind of a contribution they would make over the next 30 years. So between now and 2050, how much improvement in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases or materials saved would each of these strategies contribute over that time span? And the data that Jeannie Gang's referring to comes from European Environment Agency report. So some of them are great, like increasing the intensity of use, retrofitting, of course, maximizing recycled content. So I've kind of used those headings to structure the different examples. Starting at number 5, use of prefabricated facades. So you get 29 points for doing that. This is a fantastic little building by Anthracite, which is a Sydney-based practice. It's called Waratah Secondary House. So it's a granny flat, effectively. It's on the back of a larger block. It's got 2 key modes of construction because it sits within a zone prone to flooding up to 1.2 meters. So you can see where basically the sill is of that front door is that 1.2 meter mark. The ground, I guess, pediment is made out of blockwork and there's no services in there. So it's a kind of open garage storage space. All the services are lifted up into the house. So if that were to flood, you can then hose it out and just sort of clean it off and keep going. Up above, though, is the prefabricated pieces. So this is all, I think it's SIPS panels, so structurally insulated prefab units, clipped together, dropped on site, very quickly assembled. Tiny footprint, I think it's something like 70 or 80 square meters and 2 bedrooms. So, you know, this is not tiny home stuff. It's a proper family house. Really great example of the types of things we could be doing in the suburbs. Up next, choice of bio-based materials gets you 85 points. This is a project by one of my students, Gary Ma. He was looking at Shepparton, flooding again in particular, and proposed this 3-story building for unhoused people in Shepparton, lifted up off the floodplain. So it's in a residential area, but a site that is so flooding that no one's dared build on it. And he's shown a way, again, by lifting up where you could operate in that area. What was really great about this project, which won the Bates Smart Award last year, is Gary prototyped hempcrete made from seeds that he collected from the site. So again, getting into materials and suggesting how that building could be put together with natural materials. Maximize recycled content. This is Narrabundah House by Michael Tolhurst in Canberra. There was a cottage on the site made of brick. When that cottage was demolished, all of those bricks were cleaned and repurposed, and he's made this, it's a passive house standard residential home in Canberra. And as an architect, he also was involved in the building, and he documented this process through an Instagram channel, which was amazing. Like, what does it look like to really tape up a seam? What does it look like? How's my energy tracking through the different seasons? And he's sharing the data. What it shows, though, is how incredibly complex and difficult it is to achieve a sustainable level like this in terms of needing to be hands-on about every single junction, every single detail to ensure that level of, I guess, insulation and draft proofness. What's the comment? We cannot see the share. Oh dear. Well, I'm nearly at the end. We'll have to send it around to the people online. That is annoying. We solved it for the room.
Can.
Yeah. Oh, I can. Okay. Retrofitting, 100 points for that. Okay. This is Jenny Edwards in Canberra, who has a background as a environmental energy like auditor expert, and then who's then went on to train in architecture. So combining those two, I guess, modes of thinking and doing projects which, I put this forward as a project to be published in Architecture Australia, and, to all of their credit, they maintain the high standards of what architecture is or should be. And they told me it's not really AA, is it? And so, and that's because of its kind of modesty, I think. These are small budget projects, taking a crappy 2-star 1970s clinker brick Canberra house, and through some very clever interventions, taking it up to 7 stars for only 200K. So putting another 50 years of life into that building and completely reducing the bills for the people who live there. It's not going to be on the cover of a magazine, but I think we need much more architecture like this, and Jenny's a great advocate for this kind of work. Final one, increase the intensity of use. This is, oh, come on, AA. We got it in there in the end. I just had to profile a few other projects alongside it. Increasing the intensity of use, which is really right up there on top. And I was so impressed and surprised by that, because it's something that we so rarely talk about in these conversations. They're so often dominated by technical solutions that actually the top two ones there, which is delay, demolition, and intensity of use, which are, I would say, kind of social questions around creating new narratives for places, but also reconfiguring how we arrange them spatially or socially. Those ones don't tend to be focused on in these types of forums. So this is a project by Sophie. You can see her there in the blue jacket on the right, Sophie Tuck. Again, for a site in Shepparton. This is the final crits we had at the Shepparton Art Museum. She was looking at 3 1940s public housing, freestanding single-family homes built by the Ministry of Housing, and through some very careful and targeted interventions, she's turned those 3 homes into 9. And those are 9 homes which are 1 and 2 bedroom, so much more appropriate to the housing need, particularly in the regions where we have a huge excess of 3 and 4 bedroom homes, but very few 1 and 2 bedrooms, which are more affordable. And all built in a way that is very easy to edit and to build, no fancy technology, but driven by a kind of social center for this house. So you can imagine cluster living, kids running in and out of different people's houses, a kind of secure shared garden in the center. And that was driven by her research into the role that the house plays in asserting gender roles and how to subvert that. She then did a quick study on the whole block. If you took 19 homes, you could have 45 homes with this kind of strategy. So again, densifying, intensing, with it barely, almost invisible from the street. You wouldn't know that there was a development happening, and yet you've doubled the density of the number of people living there, or the number of homes, even more than doubled the number of people. And that's the beautiful vision of Sophie's project. I will end there, and I'm sorry that we started late, but I wanted to just make a short conclusion to say, as each of these projects illustrate, getting to zero is difficult and unglamorous, requiring an attention to detail, taping every gap, and dogged rigor in researching every product that's not widespread in the construction industry, nor celebrated in the design industry. In the last issue of AA, I wrote that confusingly, good architecture is not the same as architecture that does good. There I was referring to social good, but the same could also be applied to environmental good. This work isn't properly valued yet. Shrouded in technical jargon and data, it remains difficult to make sense of for anyone except those with niche expertise. Architects can do much to cut through this complexity and to demonstrate sustainable living that is popular and affordable. It's time to create this positive vision of a future that really does touch the earth lightly. Thank you.
Do share screen one. Hopefully that has come through.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we're seeing it.
Technology, right?
Seamless, Tom.
Oh, indeed, indeed. We rehearsed this for sure. Super. Thanks very much. Hello, everyone, and yeah, thanks for joining us this afternoon. And sorry I can't be with you in what seems to be an absolutely lovely room. Thanks to Marita and Brendan and the Retrofit Lab for having me, and really pleased to be presenting alongside Rory today. Loving a lot of the thought leadership articles that I've been reading of his. So here's a quick overview of the topics I'll cover. So I'll start by doing just a little tiny bit of background about Okana Global and who I am and why I should be talking about retrofit. Then for context, I want to describe Scotland's built environment and then move through how Scotland has been tackling retrofit and what our journey has looked like so far. And then what we're doing and planning to do moving forwards. And I'll group all the lessons learned towards the end as well. So starting with a very brief insight into Okana, because I always think it's good when you have somebody from outside the country to get an idea of kind of where they're coming from. So Okana is a built environment specialist consultancy. We're based in 24 countries across the world, and I2C architects in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Brisbane, they're a fundamental part of what we do and what we do in Australia. And we also have a core team with distinct expertise and knowledge areas, and those are shaped around strategy and intelligence, data and digital, safety resilience, urban place shaping, and also environmental and sustainability, which is the area that I lead. And here are just kind of some flagship projects that we've worked on around the globe, all had some element of sustainability to them. More and more having more retrofit included, specifically the domestic retrofit strategy that we delivered for the Korean Energy and Economic Institute a few years ago. So that's Okana in a nutshell. Now moving on to a wee bit more about me, and thanks to Brendan for the introduction, but just to give a bit more context. So my background is architectural technology and then specialized in building physics and human behavior on that journey. And when I was at Edinburgh Napier in the Institute for Sustainable Construction, I began to specialize in building performance and human comfort. In the early 2000s, there was a huge funding opportunity in the UK called Retrofit for the Future. And that was where we and I had learned a lot about what retrofit is and what retrofit isn't, and some of the really hopefully useful insights I'm going to share here today. Then after that funding had ended, I was one of the founding scientists behind retrofitscotland.org, which is a knowledge exchange platform which ran for a few years, and there's a revival happening there just now on knowledge exchange platforms, which I'll get into in a moment. And then I ran a small company focused on supporting local authorities, housing association, housing co-ops, builders, architects, surveyors on navigating the world of retrofit. So back before it was called thought leadership, I was delivering a lot in the way of knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange on the topic of retrofit. Even way back before we were calling it retrofit, back when we were calling it energy efficiency refurbishment and green renovation, things like that. I spoke a lot at trade industry forums, and I published quite a bit of work on the stuff that we were doing in the early days and more recently in Scotland, and technical papers on the do's and don'ts, and refurbishment case studies on what we learned and the mistakes we had made along the way, including frameworks and tender specifications and things like that for public sector. And during that time, I had a chance to work on some truly amazing buildings within Scotland's building stock, and also some not so amazing buildings, but nonetheless very important. And because we're now taking embodied carbon and whole life cycle seriously, as we should have been all this time, these types of buildings that aren't so easy on the eye, they're becoming even more important. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. So that's my background. I want to just give a little bit more background for context on Scotland, just so you know where we're coming from in terms of things that we found on the journey. So Scotland has primarily a temperate climate. It rains about 70% of the year. It has a really high relative humidity. It's about plus 80% all year round. We get a lot of driving rain. Sun is fairly hard to come by with us, but when it does come out, it comes out in force, and we're getting a lot more significant instances of overheating at the moment. Even some of the retrofit projects that I've been monitoring the past couple of weeks, we've seen internal temperatures going above 23, 24, 25 degrees. So just a little bit more then. So Scotland has a population of 5.5 million people, and most of those people live between Glasgow and Edinburgh, which we call Scotland's Central Belt. We've got 8 cities, different sizes. Glasgow is the largest, with 12% of the population. Inverness, the smallest, the north there, has 1% of the population. We've got lots of towns and cities dotted around the coast and some in the Highlands. And about 98% of Scotland is rural, and only 17% of our population lives in those rural areas. But it is the rural areas and the areas between the big cities that's growing the fastest, resulting in quite a disparate approach to construction and to how we are thinking about retrofit at the moment because of supply chains issues and remote access. From a kind of policy perspective, Scotland's broken down into 32 local authorities, or councils, sometimes they're called. Each have their own retrofit guidance and aspirations, but they're all underpinned by an overarching goal of achieving a net zero Scotland by 2045. And those local differences do bring some additional complexities, because many of those local authorities have distinct architecture and different building typologies, which I'll come on to in a moment. Now, we do every year what's called the Scottish House Condition Survey, and we break our buildings down into 2 groups. We have domestic and dwellings, which is just our residential stock, and we have non-domestic, which is everything else. And our building regulations that dictate the building performance and energy efficiency also come in the 2 categories, domestic and non-domestic. And I'll say up front that we know a lot more about our domestic dwellings than we do about our non-domestic. Now, we use this annual survey every year to help us define the housing stock. And it does a fairly decent job of categorizing our stock, our domestic stock of buildings, into 5 very crude categories: detached, semi-detached, terraced, tenement, flats, and others. And then we break those categories down into 5 age groups. So just a kind of quick insight: the post-1982 detached dwelling and the tenement flat are 2 of the largest typologies, and that number will naturally keep growing, and primarily because these make up the bulk of the feeder villages that are building around our larger towns and cities. The 1945 to 1982 terrace type, it makes up a big chunk of the central belt between Edinburgh and Glasgow, which really surged after 1945. And in the pre-1919 buildings, which are tenement flats, which are the kind of the iconic stone buildings you see when somebody Googles Edinburgh or Glasgow, they make up a significant part of our city centres. So we use the Energy Performance Certificate, or the EPC, as a primary KPI for our domestic dwellings energy efficiency. So on this relatively simple scale, A is great and G not so great. It is the single most important metric, though, for the allocation of retrofit funding, and it is the metric used by national and local authority to define the impact of the funding they're allocating for domestic retrofit. It is a very crude tool. It has a lot of limitations, and I'll quickly touch on that later. Last piece of context then. The latest House Condition Survey highlighted the continued fuel poverty crisis that we've been dealing with in Scotland for as long as records have been kept. The most recent data from 2023, on top of the charts on the slide there, 34% of our households are in fuel poverty. That's up from 2022, and almost 20% are living in extreme fuel poverty. That's again up from 2022. So that has shifted the focal point in our retrofit to net zero. So now carbon was always a big important element for us, but now we must also retrofit to not only encompass carbon, but also cost in terms of fuel cost and comfort in terms of occupancy comfort. So that has given us three C's of retrofit: carbon, cost, and comfort. And there's a fourth C that we're bringing online, which I'll come on to in a second. Right, so let's jump on to the retrofit journey so far, and you can kind of see what's happened over the past 25 years. Now, this particular slide has taken me absolutely ages to design and build and fact check, so it's going to stay on the screen for just a little while. Now, the retrofit milestones in our journey can be categorized into legislation or policy, knowledge milestones, key reports and strategies, and funding. Now, I'd love to go through all of these because each of these have some really valuable lessons learned and each have merit in their own right. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to start to group it in chunks of different years and then give you a quick overview of what the real lesson was, and then I'll start to bring this to a close. So from 1999 to 2005, that was a kind of epoch moment. That gives Scotland authority over what England was doing with their energy efficiency of buildings. It set the new Scottish building standards, and it introduced the concept of an energy performance certificate. In 2007 to 2009, this is when we started getting real guidance and insights and pots of funding to experiment and to test out and do demos and pilot studies on what retrofit means. And it also started the passive house movement in Scotland and introduced the idea that retrofit should be data-driven. I'm going to also come back to that. In that 2007-2009 period, we, as many others, had that horrendous market crash, which really shaped the years after 2009. So after 2009, policy really took a bit of a back seat because there was a massive focus on recovering the new housing market. But during this time after 2009, funding, peer-to-peer knowledge and guidance strategies really took over and started to stimulate the retrofit industry on the art of the possible. So that 2010, 2015 era, during this period, we saw a lot more funding based on the previous 5 years of what we learned from all the demos and pilot studies, and that continued to stimulate the retrofit market. Passive House also continued to grow in popularity, and the Scottish Government's Historic Environment Scotland Department took up the charge of informing how we retrofit our historic and heritage buildings. 2015 to 2021, sadly, not only did we miss our eradicating fuel poverty target, but as you've seen, our fuel poverty issue has been on the rise ever since. So this has then given way to funding to shift to more energy efficiency space heating systems, which is where heat pumps entered the fray. Now we got more knowledge in the form of Historic Environment Scotland's engine shed, which was a building dedicated to materials and technologies and skills. And then also we had retrofit training centres and popping up within colleges and universities to upskill the sector, both the trades and the consultants, to work with different archetypes. PAS 2035 and PAS 2038 then introduced the concept of a dedicated architectural retrofit professional within the consultancy roles. 2021 to 2024, policy really started to come back online, and the heat in building strategy really triggered that with a clear mandate on focusing on thermal envelope first. New, more robust approaches to solving fuel poverty are being developed. So it's not just a target we have to hit, we're now getting guidance on that. And also the planning proposal stage is being streamlined to fast track some retrofit works so we can turn them around even faster. So moving forward and move on into the lessons learned, everything that happened in the last 25-year time period around legislation, knowledge, strategies, and funding all encompassed massive step forwards in training, demystifying, and in defining how we can extrapolate into mass retrofit and delivering retrofit at volume across the entire country. The biggest lesson learned before going into the individual ones and what's being carried forward is everything needs to be data-driven and science-based. It's absolutely necessary to de-risk investment from private sector and also justify public sector involvement. and to move at speed and with confidence, and to move past the point where we're doing retrofit pilots and demos, one building at a time. So as we move into the next 20, 25 years from now to our 2045 net zero goal, the focus is on taking all that had happened, setting a new retrofit methodology for a net zero future, which to also come with some clear focus on optimizing retrofit design, which are the lessons I want to share with you in a second, and retrofit construction, which is all more lessons I want to share with you. So let's get stuck into the lessons learned then. So from a retrofit design perspective, we now understand and are designing retrofit packages based on the grade of retrofit needed. We understand that buildings have been retrofitted pretty much since they were built. So we've got levels of deep retrofit, shallow retrofit, whole building retrofit, envelope only, technology replacement, and we now know how to categorize those types of interventions to get the right consultants in the right place at the right time. We did focus on our pre-1919 archetype for far too long. Now with only 20 years to go to 2045, we're further behind than we could have been if we had more of a broader approach to looking at all of our archetypes. We tended to ignore anything built after 1945 because we assumed we would just knock it down and start again. But with embodied carbon now being metric, we can't do that so easily. So because dwellings that we retrofitted back in 2010, back in the early days of this kind of science approach, they're now needing to be re-retrofitted today because even though we did all that work 15 years ago, they're now not ready for 2045. So we've come to understand the value of something called design for future retrofit, meaning that today we're retrofitting with the understanding that someone will need to go back into that house, remove, replace, and add new materials and technologies. So we're now consciously designing retrofit with design for disassembly principles, which also massively helps with our whole life cycle carbon strategies. We understand that heat pump efficiency suffers massively if the outside compressor is facing towards our coldest prevailing winds, which is from the northeast for us. We also found that we've focused far too long on R values for insulation, and we're only now really come to term with psi values and thermal bridging, which we're now having to upskill very quickly in country. We had with a really big focus recently on net zero. There was a shaky moment where we started to shift from fabric first to technology first. Now that caused a lot of issues with technologies and HVAC systems being oversized. Then when the fabric was retrofitted later, the heating system suffered efficiency drops. And now we know that the word fabric first isn't just a cute little phrase that people use. It actually does have meaning. Local authority planning and building standard officers have massively upskilled, a real testament to our colleges and universities, meaning that the authorities who are approving the retrofit works are in a much more knowledgeable place and have begun to streamline the approval process for retrofit projects. The new retrofit professionals and roles set out in PAS 2035 and PAS 2038, that provided a real kind of authoritative framework that increases the confidence and clear lines of liability within the design and build team on who is responsible for what. Much like how Passive House increases level of trust, that everyone on the design team is doing the right thing, PAS 2035 makes retrofit more trustable, more trusted and more traceable. I mentioned embodied carbon a little earlier. So new early stage life cycle assessment tools are allowing us to do better decision making on retrofit versus plot renewal versus complete demo. And the planning departments within our local authorities are now demanding to see that analysis before they provide planning consent. For funding systems and pots of public money to work, return on investment and payback has to happen within 7 years for that to be justified. And we have moved from an intervention-centric approach where we take a technology and try to find a building that can take the technology. We've moved from a technology approach to a building-centric approach where we build retrofit packages based on what those archetypes can take. Lessons learned then from the construction side. Earlier, I mentioned that we discovered the need for retrofit to be data-driven. So we learned to utilize and implement building performance evaluation, hardware and monitoring within our retrofit works. And that's the methodology I want to share with you in a second. And then from that, we introduced the British Standard 40101, which standardized the approach to building domestic monitoring and measurements. We learned that to retrofit at scale compounds the risk, and risk must be a very important KPI in decision making. I'll come back to risk in a moment. We also learned then that heat pumps from a construction perspective aren't fit and forget. And by that, I mean that there's a behavioral component to how residents use and interact with heat pumps to maintain their thermal comfort. We found that the greater the difference between the resident's previous heating system and the new heat pump, the longer it takes for them to use the heating system more efficiently without some form of educational intervention. Which then brings me on to behavior change. Now, the rebound effect is something that we struggled with for years. And it all came down to the complexity of the controls and the number of decision points the occupant has to make or interact with to achieve thermal comfort while operating the home's heating, cooling, and ventilation system efficiently. Also in this topic is maintenance of these innovative technologies. So net zero, we've kind of come to understand that net zero retrofit essentially boils down to moving non-domestic type technologies, heat pumps, mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, smart meters, etc., into our homes. But unlike non-domestic buildings, our homes do not come with full-time, fully trained building facility managers. So again, we learned a lot about creating quick start guides for the residents and how to let them know how to use the equipment efficiently, why it's important and what it's there to do and how to maintain that. In the early days, we absolutely tried to run before we knew before we knew where our feet were. And that meant that we skipped the vital repair and restore stage. So before doing the retrofit, we didn't consider the building might need repaired or restored, which locked in a lot of problems that we have had to go back and de-retrofit dissolve. More recently, we've discovered the danger of over-retrofitting and unguided retrofitting. So draft proofing is by far the easiest, cheapest, and fastest form of retrofit. It doesn't require an architect, it doesn't require a builder, it doesn't even need permission from the local authority, but it is by far the single most complex form of retrofit because it interconnects with ventilation heat loss, thermal bridging, condensation, maintaining indoor air quality, etc. So draft proofing, and to a smaller degree, any type of thermal retrofit can massively reduce the building's ventilation heat loss, which is great. But it also reduces the quantity and quality of air change rates, which affects the indoor air quality. So retrofitting to solve one problem like ventilation heat loss can create a ton of other problems around respiratory health, overheating, moisture accumulation, and condensation. We found that thermal batteries are an excellent technology to really reduce fossil fuel consumption for domestic hot water use, which is excellent because fabric first and energy efficient lighting, for example, does a lot of heavy lifting for the bulk of the dwelling's energy demand. But until we started using thermal batteries, reducing energy demand for hot water seemed almost impossible. It was also a really important step and excellent find to have that technology step change for homes where gas or oil boilers are still very new and it's arguably too soon to move that home to heat pumps. Now we also had some great results with ultra thin material like aerogel and space therm for internal wall insulation. And finally, we have learned that we've learned the power of mass timber as a modern method of retrofit. So if we need to extend the home, not just retrofit the existing envelope, if we use a super energy efficient system like mass timber CLT, for example, that means we can massively improve the whole building's energy and use intensity. So last couple of slides. So this is the 4-step retrofit methodology that we have come to design and implement. So a lot of what I've just spoke about is encapsulated in this 4-step approach to speed up and de-risk retrofit. And the first step involves archetyping and profiling, which is essential for benchmarking, mapping, and clustering. Then we do the data capture. for a sample of those house types, and we use building performance evaluation hardware to do that pre-retrofit baseline study. And it helps us to identify if there's something going on in the building that we can't see with the naked eye. Then we use all that real world data to calibrate our energy and building performance models. So we get a calibrated digital twin of the physical building. So if we do decide to only apply one retrofit intervention, we can immediately see what knock-on side effect that has in other aspects of the building. So we're not end up building in and locking in other issues. And the final step is once the retrofit interventions have been applied, we go back with our building performance evaluation hardware and we remeasure what has happened there. And that provides three really important outputs. It's a quality assurance check that we did the right thing. It provides an as designed, as built comparison. It provides a pre-retrofit, post-retrofit comparison and helps to quantify and validate the return on investment. And all that feedback knowledge turns into feed-forward training and skills material. I just want to share the last couple of things with you in terms of what the country is doing at the moment. So an academic consortium led by University of Edinburgh and supported by ourselves are taking Scotland's 2.7 million dwellings and those very crude 5 archetypes that the Scottish House Condition Survey have created. And we're creating a very comprehensive standard set of archetypes specifically designed for accelerating mass retrofit and having targeted intervention per cluster, as opposed to taking a dwelling by dwelling approach. In recent months, we've got the Scottish National Adaptation Plan, which has introduced the 4th C. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned there was 3 C's of retrofit: cost, comfort, and I forget the third one, which is just my head. Cost, comfort, and carbon, sorry. The 4th C is now climate, which means we have to design our retrofit interventions that are climate resilient and climate adaptable. And because we've still not solved our retrofit poverty problem, we now are going to get design guidance to help us get from 34% of the population in fuel poverty down to 5% in the next 5 to 15 years. Finally, then, we have the Construction Innovation Centre in Scotland, the Built Environment Smarter Transformation, or BEST, and they've been mandated to be a single source of retrofit wisdom for the country, combining all the knowns and unknowns into one collaborative hub with a scope of delivering retrofit knowledge and workshops for contractors, trades, architects, consultants, designers, and all of our 13 universities plug into this knowledge base, creating a single source of knowledge and point of contact. And because we know that our EPC calculation methodology is pretty much busted, we now have the EPC reform consultation, which is ending this month, with a very clear objective of turning EPCs from a calculation method into an in situ measurement method to define the building's actual performance before we decide on retrofit. And that's it from me. Sorry for going over time there, but thanks for listening.
That's great, John. Thank you very much. We're going to be tight for time on some questions, but we might take one. I've got a couple here, but I might let the floor offer up a question if there's one around the table here. Yeah.
As an architect who's done a lot of retrofit and reuse, I think one of the key barriers to doing it at scale is the risks around the unknown we're going to find, and also as per those high-rise work housing towers, they're being knocked down because they don't have 2.7 metres ceilings allegedly. But I think the real reason is that there's just too much risk that's not reflected in the fees that are paid for the consultant team, and I think that's a real issue in our industry. People dream up reasons to knock down stuff all the time, but I think the real barrier is that because you save a lot of money in architectural and consultants' fees and funds a percentage of the cost, you save a lot of money by not knocking it down and create yourself, 3 times the amount of work. It just doesn't stack up.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you on all of those things, and we're fairly close to the towers.
Yeah.
And the reports or the findings that came out from the government to say why we're knocking them down was identifying all of the problems, which is step 1. Step 2 is actually, for every technical problem, there's a technical solution, then how buildable and what's it going to cost and all the rest of it. And they never looked at any of that. So it was very telling that during that class action that's gone on,
Mm.
you know, 2 reports were done by independent groups of architects that showed how it could be done with every single part of those, the floor heights,
Yeah.
the plumbing, the whole lot. You know,
Yeah.
they've all got solutions, and can all be done quicker and cheaper, you know, according to people who have put some time and effort into it. So, John, is that a factor in Scotland? Because risks and particularly unknowns in buildings, asbestos and those sorts of things, a big issue here for non-domestic. I'm not so sure about domestic. Does that come up in your radar?
Absolutely, and it did. It was one of the driving forces that had created this paradigm shift within local authorities and our registered social landlords, like housing cooperatives and community housing and housing associations and such. There was a huge amount of upskilling we had to do in terms of the value, the true value of the building to the community, the cultural value, but also the carbon, the embodied carbon that's already been paid off on those buildings in terms of the amount of masonry and concrete and steel that are in those buildings. And there was that mindset shift to, well, if we're going to try and keep these and we need to de-risk the process, we've got to find out what's going on. Now, as you can imagine, we have a huge issue with moisture in buildings up here with us. So a big part of pretty much anything that we do before making a go, no-go decision is working out if the building typology can be saved. And through the work that the chartered bodies have done up here for architects and surveyors, but also through the work that the local authorities have been doing through knowledge, and the universities and colleges in terms of the knowledge, is putting a greater value on that feasibility and scoping stage to work out, well, what really is going on with these buildings. Can they be saved, and how much can we keep? And like we said, until recently, all that we were keeping was anything before 1920, really, because they were the
I'll get you to pause just there, because it leads into another question. And I was interested in Rory's view on this, and I loved your slide of the new house with the kid out the front hosing down the bike and all of that sort of thing. Do you have thoughts on where that mind shift, how far in the future that mind shift is in Australia, to go from expanding suburbs, and particularly in Melbourne, to actually retrofitting in the suburbs and the density that you're talking about? What do you think we need to do to get there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I mean, there's so many moving parts, and it's all linked to money, and it's all linked to people's life stages, and it's all linked to people's, retirement funds, which they're sitting on. But I guess, back of the envelope response would be a diversification of the typologies that are available, right? So if we've got empty nesters rattling around in a big home because their kids have grown up and left, but there's really no incentive to move them into another place because of the asset that's tied up in it, and they don't want to leave their neighborhood, we need to be doing really great granny flats in those backyards with the incentives aligned, to encourage them to move, but also to stay within their community and their neighborhood and free up that home. There's other strategies of, we've got too many big homes, full stop. We've seen those great reports on the housing crisis. Meanwhile, 13 million spare bedrooms, 3 million spare homes. So I don't think we've got a housing crisis. I think we've got a housing allocation crisis, and we need to think really cleverly around how to redistribute and encourage people to shift into housing which is appropriately sized, so that other types of families can move in. It's a big piece of research there, I think, but it could be really interesting. And retrofit could be part of the problem or part of the solution rather, in terms of, how would you create multiple entries, fire barriers within an existing home, so that you could have 3 dwellings or 4 dwellings within a large suburban home, rather than one 5-bedroom house with 2 people living in it. I think that's where you can create all sorts of different other social benefits as well. Multiple generations, students helping out older people with the shopping. Like, we could think of it as a real positive thing for the way that we live.
Yeah, opportunity. I'm just going to quickly switch to what's been going on in retrofit. We'll come back to questions because there's other questions about, including online, if people want to stay, but we're 2 minutes off 5 o'clock. So just very quickly, a couple of headlines. The housing towers class action went back to court a few weeks ago. As you may not know, the judge had made the call to see whether the government could claim cabinet privilege over the reports that were produced that were supposed to justify them knocking down the buildings. And unfortunately, or disappointingly, they ruled that those reports are subject to cabinet privilege. So we're not going to get to see those reports, which were the basis of those decisions. Seems very controversial to me, like I said, given that there have been 2 other reports produced by independent parties in the meantime that show that those towers could be retrofitted faster and quicker than the knockdown and rebuild options. So that's disappointing. The lawyers are now waiting to see what the outcome of the class action is, which is infringement on residents' rights, as in the government's got a duty of care to look after them. So we'll see where that's going to go. Don't Waste Buildings, which is a UK initiative, grassroots by companies looking at retrofitted buildings, is starting up in Melbourne, which is really good news. The first meeting was this afternoon, and Claire Bowles from Akana is behind it. She mentioned that Gavin Salt. Gavin, are you in the room or online somewhere? Maybe not. She mentioned you might say a few words, but in the absence of that, it's a grassroots retrofit movement led by consultants and people in industry. If you're interested in getting involved, please contact Claire. At her email address is there. We'll be putting the presentation up on the website, hopefully in a few days' time. STAR Toolkit, which is, for those of you know, Sarah Wilkinson, who's been really supportive of retrofit from UTS. That's the Sustainable Temporary Adaptive Reuse Toolkit, something that was developed through COVID to make use of underutilised office space. That's being launched in Sydney, April the 8th. There's the Precinct Retrofitting for Decarbonisation, DBI, which is happening in Perth, 28th of April at Curtin. So you'll be able to look that up online. And there's events happening in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne as well. So they'll be coming soon. Keep an eye out for those. There's an exhibition happening, which Enzo alluded to earlier on. Actually, I think that was the last meeting, wasn't it? But if there's an exhibition happening in the space downstairs in MSD, we're putting that together, led by University of Melbourne, but we're open to suggestions. If you have models and interesting things happening in retrofit, let us know and we can see if we can work them into that exhibition. Opening is 25th of July and it'll run through to September. And the Energy Efficiency Council have their national conference 27th of May in Melbourne, of which retrofit is hopefully going to be one of the topics of conversation. So that's a very quick rundown for the other things happening. On that, we might go back to questions. And so feel free, if you want to leave, we're officially 1 minute past 5, but also feel free to stay and be a part of the conversation, online or in person. Marita, what's our online question that we had?
John actually has jumped in there.
John has answered. Well, are there other questions around the table here? John, are you scratching your back or are you putting your hand up? Okay. No problem. We might just go back to that question because it sounded like an interesting one for people to. So, John, I don't know if you want to answer this just online for everybody's benefit, but questions for John. Would love to hear more about the process of upskilling the local authorities to streamline planning and approvals, and what level of government is the retrofit funding coming from?
Yeah, sure thing. I ran out of characters on answering that one, so happy to kind of elaborate. So it started off as a cost efficiency measure, where way back at the kind of early part of that 25-year time period, EPCs were becoming more important, which meant that the housing associations and the local authorities who had so many houses had to get an EPC in there within a very quick turnaround time. So the consultancy and the private sector just couldn't turn that around. So they started upskilling internally, and that whet the appetite of the housing officers in that space. And then because local authority from our national government are constantly being squeezed on net zero, get your building stock ready, get your building stock fixed up, etc. It compounded that need for the housing officers and local authorities to know more about their housing stock. And the first thing was just, well, how many buildings do we actually have, and what are they made of, and how comfortable are they? And then that started to trigger the conversation around, well, how does the stone in our Glasgow buildings handle moisture compared to the stone in our counterparts authority over in Edinburgh, for example? And then there's so many local authority building trade conferences that happen every year where they just kind of share that knowledge and move that along. And that's how that began to grow and got that paradigm shift. And with the universities and colleges churning out more building performance specialists going into that space, it just became perpetual, where the knowledge just kept growing. And I have to say, some of my colleagues in local authority are almost more knowledgeable than some of my colleagues in the consultancy sector on the building typology and building performance at the moment.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I was very interested in the as well in the retrofit professional side of things. How was that received by industry? Did that create a whole new market for education and university courses, and seen as a cost and a burden to be carried by industry? Was that sort of welcomed? John, can you hear
Sorry,
me?
mate. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that was a question to you. I was just saying I was interested in the aspect of the retrofit professionals. Presumably
Yes.
that's a registration, is it? But was that a welcome thing in industry, or was it seen by some parts as a cost burden and way of creating new university courses or education?
Yeah, there was inertia to overcome there, and the main driving force was at that early kind of 2007 kind of period. There was a very dispersed group of architects and consultants and surveyors who were specializing in retrofit. And during that kind of down period, with the first kind of market crash, those individuals started coming together, and we created some organizations like, for example, the Scottish Ecological Design Association, and there was a couple of retrofit bodies and the Passive House Trust set up, etc. And then they started lobbying their chartered bodies, so the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists, which I'm chair of and was chair of for a while in Scotland, and then RIBA for architects, RICS for building surveyors, started lobbying upwards, going, we need to start informing our members more about this. This is coming online. There's loads of money out there for us to kind of tap into. There's loads of buildings, a big market opportunity for us to do these things. And then the chartered body started stepping up and producing CPD events and producing documents. And some of the best documents we have on frameworks and retrofit techniques come from the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, which we still use today. And the RICS one is the gold standard for measuring embodied carbon in existing buildings.
And are these at domestic scale, or is this in non-domestic?
It's domestic scale. It's a little bit agnostic, but we haven't really focused on non-domestic in country at all, really. The thought there is that a lot of our non-domestic buildings either were domestic at one point. So a lot of the buildings in our city centres were, flats or tenement buildings at one point in time. So you treat them domestically from an intervention perspective, or they're owned by large multinationals that have like a big ESG department and kind of know what they're doing. So we do hyper focus a little bit on domestic, and let's say most of the buildings we have are single family dwellings or those tenement flats, and that's where the focus has been.
I'd be interested in opinions around the room on where professionals sit in Australia on retrofit. Anthony, as one of the architects I know who's got very interested in retrofit, I mean, do you have lots of colleagues out there in a similar boat that are singing the same tune, or are we earlier days, or do you think that we're ready for that sort of change in Australia?
my personal view is that there are a lot of, in Melbourne, lots of small practices that are essentially doing a version of retrofit. I think we're really lucky in that sort of space that there is that kind of expertise at a grassroots level. That would be my opinion. Whether it doesn't sort of extend out into the suburbs and other places, but we do actually think we've got good expertise in that area.
And would you think that's backed up by technical expertise as well?
I think it's practical expertise. I don't know if it's technical. It's sort of based on experience and kind of doing it over a long period of time. It's something that I think should be acknowledged in some back here. James, who's sitting next to me, is also a practicing architect. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's active, very active forums like energy efficiency that talks about retrofitting, I mean, insulation in particular.
Mm.
So I think that mentions that it's the level of the retrofit, it's basic retrofit or deep retrofit, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the things we have, built up here in Melbourne. I don't know about other cities, other countries, but it's something that was quite precious. I think that a small architectural practice working on retrofit, can survive, can do the work and make a difference.
Well, presumably that's partly the case though, because there's a huge amount of building stock out there and people want to upgrade their homes.
Yeah,
I'm a little bit surprised, John, at such a delineation between domestic and non-domestic. And my background is in bigger buildings, non-domestic buildings, I must admit, but I've always thought that what we've learnt on bigger buildings sort of flows down to domestic and other things. Maybe that's just because of my history. What do you guys think do you think the knowledge in retrofit of housing stock comes from, the bigger sustainability consultants and things, studies, or it comes from actually people working grassroots, finding things out for themselves?
If you come next month when I present,
Well, that's partly I'm trying to
it's
jump
gone
forward.
the other way for me. It's sort of, I've done a lot of very basic sort of stuff, replace fences, roofs, all kinds of really small projects, and sort of that's enabled, at least for me, to get some opportunities in larger school buildings, which has been great. And it's the skills that I've gotten out of the residential sector over 20 odd years that's enabled that, through a documentation process, through a problem solving skill set that I think we have, to enable that. I think for me it's gone the other way. It may be different for different people. It's hard to imagine someone who's working at a large scale descending down into residential. I just don't think that's going to happen.
And just to acknowledge what I only did residential in the last 2 years, and it was a very steep learning curve, starting with my own house. The skills that you use on a large project, on a residential project, you don't have a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer to feed into the design process. So yeah, I actually think there's a lot that sort of goes unacknowledged in the
Sure does. For us.
Yeah. Okay, are there any last questions around the table? Yeah.
I'm really interested to know how do you have access to the building material quantities, which is like a major parameter when it comes to embodied carbon. And especially because we are focusing on mass retrofitting, because we are taking the archetypal approach here. So how do you have access to all that data of the existing domestic typologies?
You maybe didn't hear.
I can probably repeat the question, yeah.
Repeat. Yeah, sorry. This one's for you, John. We didn't have the green light on the microphone going.
Yep.
So.
Sorry about that. Quick question. How do you have access to all the building material quantities of the existing domestic houses? Because that's like a major parameter in terms of embodied carbon. And that's kind of the main glitch because it's so data driven. And if we are taking the archetypal approach, and if we do not have the data for the building material quantities, you know what I mean? Like it's an incomplete process as such. So how are you guys handling that?
We have started and we are starting to scan buildings, scanning them for two reasons. One is to move, the primary function was to move retrofit to being an off-site method. So instead of having teams and teams and gangs of people going out with vans with materials coming and going, moving a lot of that process like internal wall insulation, secondary glazing off-site, so it can be done in a factory and you have fewer vehicles coming and going, which is great for from the embodied carbon side. But in terms of scanning the quantities, the work that we've been doing more recently around archetyping and profiling, we have a certain number of archetypes what University of Edinburgh are doing just now, and they have specific floor plates and volumes and wall thicknesses and size of windows and number of windows and number of slates, and all that information was being held on the retrofitscotland.org platform, which they closed down sadly in 2017, but there's been a resurgence on that, and that's how we're capturing it, and that's how we're sharing it at the moment, is from scans and from surveys, especially from local authorities and housing associations whenever they scan and measure their buildings. In terms of, it's not going to be 100% accurate, especially for things like solid brick and solid stone. Even with some of the sandstone building, it's not sandstone the whole way through. It might only be sandstone for the first 200 mil, and then it could be just random rubble, which is quite tricky. But that's how we've been doing it.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, we're well over time, partly because there are great presentations and lots of questions to be had. So if we could just put our hands together again to thank Rory and John. Yeah, our next session is third Tuesday in April, with Anthony Damasi, and again talking about domestic scale retrofit and beyond. Yeah, so please come along and sign up for that one, and yeah, hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Joel. See you.
Thanks, John. That was great.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.